In the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, it's stated that supernatural powers or siddhis are obtained through birth, herbs, drugs, mantras, tapas, which is austerities, or samadhi yogic trance. In this episode of Not Just Yoga, I'm talking to Matthew Clark, who has spent the last 10 years researching Soma, the nectar of immortality. Stay tuned, because there's also a giveaway. Well, Matthew, it's great to see you after 25 years or whatever it was.
It's been a long time, yes.
So Matthew and I happened to be at SOAS together in the late 90s. So welcome, Matthew, to Not Just Yoga. Thank you for coming to talk about Soma, the nectar of immortality. We're going to start by saying that there is going to be a giveaway. Matthew has agreed to give away 5 PDFs of his book, The Tawny One. And all you have to do to enter is watch this episode and comment what it is that resonated with you the most and that you'll take away with you. That's all you have to do. I will put a deadline in the comment, in the details below. Yeah, so welcome, Matthew. Thanks again. And I thought maybe we could start by you explaining what Soma is.
Sure. Perhaps I'll just tell the story of how it all happened. I was at university in Wales until 1981, and then there was a significant gap when I was mostly in India. Came back to university at SOAS in 1998, and then I was doing my MA at SOAS, and I was familiar with Soma as a topic from previous studies, but I never much looked into it. But anyway, doing my MA, I was doing Indian studies. It was quite apparent that Soma, or Som, as it should be more correctly pronounced, I suppose, or Somras, the juice of Som, was obviously very important in Vedic rituals. And these, as some of you may know, the Vedas are very ancient texts. They were composed orally first about 1600 BC, and then over the next 800 or 900 years, gradually compiled and formalized, as it were. And in these texts, there are descriptions of rituals, and the most important ritual of all is the Soma ritual, the Sayagya, the yag for the Soma. And it was obviously very important. If you look at the text, it was apparent that it was a juice, it was a drink, it was drunk every few hours, and it was attributed with absolutely wondrous properties. Anyway, I got intrigued with that, and then I started looking a bit at the botanical identifications of this plant, which was assumed to be one plant at the time, and just sort of started vaguely collecting notes on this topic over the years. And then going back to about 2015 it was, then I got interested in this topic again, and started looking at it more closely, and then started looking at the botanical identifications. And none of them seem to fit. There's been a lot of work on this topic starting about 250 years ago when scholars started looking at the Soma, obviously important in rituals and still practiced to this day, but using substitutes. And it's well known in India, and it has been known in India for at least 1,000 years, that they were doing the correct rituals, doing the mantras correctly and the form of the ritual correctly, and they were collecting plants and making this concoction, this Soma concoction, but they knew it from substitute plants. So what were the original plants? And they say this has been a topic that's been engaging scholars for about 250 years. And many dozens of theories published about this plant, the magical Soma plant. So the discussion really it goes in several different ways. On the one hand, there are some scholars who say that still to this day that the Soma plant or Soma is not psychedelic. They say it's just a ritual plant used for various reasons. It's not psychedelic at all. No evidence for that. There's some very learned scholars who say that. And then on the other side, there are scholars who say, no, it's psychoactive in some way. The earliest suggestions were often of alcoholic preparations, beer and so on. This is going back to the sort of 18th, 19th century. And as I say, you ended up with dozens and dozens of publications on this. The field changed significantly in 1967, and then finally published in 1968 again, a book called Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality. That was by Gordon Wasson. Gordon Wasson was a banker-turned-scholar who actually did great pioneering work on mushrooms of the world, and in particularly of psychoactive mushrooms in South America. He became famous for his publication of the use of psilocybin mushrooms in Mexico. in the 1950s. And then, having gone down the psilocybin route, he then got interested in what this Soma was in the Vedas, and he also came to the conclusion there that it was a mushroom. In fact, he argued that it was the fly agaric mushroom, Amanita muscaria. That was the first suggestion by anybody that Soma was a psychedelic, because it was before the 1960s. People knew virtually nothing about psychedelics at all, but of course there was the explosion in the mid 1960s psychedelics, and then people understood what psychedelic meant.
But
anyway,
what made him say that? What was his conclusion?
Well, interestingly, I've done a lot of work on the background to all this too, but he became convinced that because of his discovery in Mexico, that mushrooms lay at the root of many of the world's religious beliefs. And in fact, he made several other suggestions about what Soma could be before he hit upon mushrooms. But interestingly, it was a scholar he was working with, Wendy O'Flaherty-Donegal, a great Sanskritist, and he worked with her, and because Watson didn't know any Sanskrit. So Wendy Donegal was working with him on various texts, and during a casual conversation, she mentioned fly agaric mushrooms, which at the time wasn't much aware of. And then suddenly he said, "Oh, it's fly agaric mushrooms. That's what they were using. That's what the Soma was." Wendy Donegal, right from the beginning, she said, "Actually, I don't think it is. I'm very skeptical about that." But once he got his idea, once he got it into his head that it was this fly agaric mushroom, he went to town on this and convinced that that's what they were using, this fly agaric mushroom. The point is that, well, several points really, that on the one hand, fly agaric mushroom, it certainly is used for psychedelic purposes by various, famously in Siberia and in the peninsula that leads down towards Japan, around there, and that's sort of eastern Russia. And it's used by shaman. It's used by various people in those communities for psychedelic purposes. But it's very toxic in its natural state. And there's famously the accounts by early Russian anthropologists of the people in that region drinking people's pee or deer pee, that in fact it's processed the stuff to make it less toxic. And so if you drink the pee of the reindeer or drink the pee of other humans who've drunk it, you can actually get the effect without reducing the toxicity.
Yeah.
People who've tried it, I mean, famously, there's an account by Terence McKenna. He had a go at that, and he found it very, very unpleasant, stomach cramps, and blurred vision, and so on. There have been suggestions in the scholarly literature of ways that you can purify the fly agaric to make it much less toxic by certainly peeling it or cooking it or preparing it in various ways to make it less toxic.
Mixing it? How about mixing it with something else?
Well, that hasn't been suggested. Has been suggested that the fly agaric on its own was the concoction, preparation just of fly agaric. So on the one hand, it's rather unpleasant as a psychedelic plant, but I think more importantly, when you look in the texts in the Vedas, and also I haven't even gone into this yet, but the roots of this thing of the Soma concoction actually go back to Central Asia before the people who call themselves Arya arrived in India. This is about 1600 BC. And the same concoction or the same plant or whatever it is described also in Zoroastrian text in the Avesta, which is the sacred text of the Zoroastrians. They talk about Homa, this plant Homa, and similarly revere it greatly. But they talk also about extraordinary properties of this plant. As in the Vedas, there's descriptions of a kind of near-death experience, seeing light, being very terrified, going into the clouds, and all these sorts of things. Not many passages in these texts describe these things, but they are there. Now, the other thing against this mushroom is the fact that in these texts, in the Avesta and in the Vedas, where the plant and its use are described, it's talked about as stalks of plants. And these stalks of plants are collected by somebody who's rather disreputable normally. Actually, in the Avesta, it's the women on the mountains who collect it sometimes. And then in the Vedic world, it's this rather disreputable figure who collects these plants. And it's the stalks of plants which are pounded with stones. In the Zoroastrian tradition, it's the mortar and pestle. And in the Indian tradition, in the Vedas, there's one or two references to being pounded with mortar and pestle. But otherwise, it's stones onto crushing the stalks of these plants and extracting the juice. So I think that completely rules out the idea of any sort of mushroom, because you don't pound mushrooms for hours. It's at no point, you just eat the things if you eat them. So
it kind of reminds me of the sugar cane, the way they get the juice out of the sugar cane.
very similarly, exactly.
If we look at the time of the Vedas, it was ritualistic. And you've explained in your book how there are rituals to Soma.
Yeah.
And so what would have been the intention of that ritual?
The Soma plant, as I mentioned before, is highly esteemed. In fact, in the Rig Veda, which has these 10 books, the ninth book is entirely devoted to the worship of Soma. The priests, it seems, drink this thing quite regularly. But for an outsider, it was usually a once-in-a-lifetime initiation. It was a very expensive thing to do. If you were an outsider, you had to pay lots of money, or cows in those days.
Yeah.
And lots of cows. And then you were initiated, essentially like an initiation into the priesthood, in that world of the Soma. And it's hard to know to what extent it was used, but it's, with any psychedelic culture, I mean, globally, actually, it's usually, in fact, always, I would say, a very small percentage of the population that actually regularly do psychedelics. There was a blip in the 60s when suddenly everybody was taking psychedelics, but, it's very popular. But that's not the norm. The norm is a small percentage of the population. The Brahmins of India these days comprise about 4% of India's population. I've done some rough estimates of that and talked to people about it. Possibly in the ancient world also, you're talking about a similar sort of percentage of the population, 4% of the population who were Brahmin. And so the number of people that would have been initiated outside the Brahmanic world would have been very tiny compared to the general population.
Yeah.
And it would be an initiation into the world of the Brahmins, of ritual, of Vedic culture.
Why was it only for the 4%? Why do you think they kept it for themselves?
It was just the nature of the society in ancient India.
Mm.
As you know, it's highly stratified at the caste system. It always has been. And the Brahmins in general had very little interest in the world outside their own culture. There were people living here and there, but they had very little interest. And not hostile, but it's just these communities lived very distinct from each other. So the Brahmins kept separate generally from the general population. Just as a sort of qualifier of that, I attended a talk a few years ago, which is very interesting, genetic studies of India. The interesting point for me that emerged from that was that if you take a typical call center from somewhere like New York and you look at the genetic makeup of the population, you'll have in that call center people from Europe, South America, Africa, all sorts of people who are living in the United States. But you find even within these separate, let's say you take 30 or 40 people working in that call center, there's some genetic correspondence between them, showing that in the past their groups have intermarried with other groups, not outside their own groups. But you take a call center in Bangalore, you find an extraordinarily high percentage of those people if they are Brahmin, never married outside their caste. This is like 3,500 years, so it's very distinct communities that had their own practices and their own rituals and so on. And outsiders are not generally invited inside.
Well, that's probably got something to do with the purity and pollution.
It has. That's another aspect of it. Yeah.
So is the Soma ritual similar to other Vedic rituals? It
is. It's similar in the sense that you have, in fact, there are very many kinds of Vedic ritual. I think about 130 odd types of ritual of varying lengths. Some are a few hours, some are a day or a few days, some go on for several weeks, even these rituals, teams of priests taking over. And the rituals are primarily to do with the fire, that sacred fire. And this is the same in the Zoroastrian tradition. And the fires are kept by Brahmins in their houses. Traditional Brahmins have houses, fire burning in their houses, in the hearth there. And then they have these public rituals or outdoor rituals where they will take part of the embers from the fire, go to a high place on a high hill, always high ground, make a ritual arena, a very particular kind of structure with usually 3 fireplaces and places where various participants participate in the ritual. And then these rituals there are all sorts of rituals for all sorts of purposes. There are rituals for kingship, rituals that are seasonal, and so on. And the Soma ritual is just one of the many, many rituals. But it's esteemed as the most important, the highest of the rituals. So that is an important one.
How is it that in the rituals, there's first the offering to fire. This is also in your book. First the offering to fire, then the offering to Soma, and then an offering to fire and Soma. And so, I mean, when I read that, the first thought that came to my mind was, is it that fire is the male, Soma is the female, and then you have the marriage of the two? That was the only thought that came to my mind. What would you think that means?
In the Vedic deities, we have to distinguish Vedic religion from Hindu religion, even though, of course, there's a transition. It's been like Old Testament, New Testament, or whatever. But in the Vedic world, the vast majority of the deities are male. There are a few female deities, like Vach, sound, and others, but otherwise there are many, many deities mentioned in the Vedic texts. The three most mentioned deities in the Vedic text are Agni, the god of fire, Indra, the king of the gods, Soma, who is a god, a plant, and an extract of plants.
Yeah, right. Okay, so let's rule out what I just said. So you've written there is a notion of a divine, immaterial, non-plant Soma. That's apparent, but also evidence that there was a general yet restricted awareness in medical and yogic milieu of Soma as a drug. And so through your investigations, what have you concluded?
It's tentative, the whole reconstruction of all this stuff, but I think going back to the late Bronze Age, there was a sufficient knowledge of plants to make the Soma concoction from plants that are around you. I've gone into the chemistry of that. I'll do that in a minute. And this knowledge of plants, detailed botanical knowledge really, orally spread from Central Asia into the Zoroastrian religion, into Vedic religion, and also into Greek mystery rites. Mm-hmm. The Greek mystery rites also start around 1600 BC. I think that's a key date because I mentioned also the eruption of the Santorini volcano, 1500 BC, large-scale migration throughout Asia, which is well known to historians. But why? I think it was probably due to the eruption of the volcano. Mm-hmm. This is when there were these migrations from Central Asia to Punjab area of India, and of course other migrations to Greece and to now Iran and so on. And this psychoactive psychedelic concoction, the knowledge of this, is passed down from generation to generation. As I mentioned, it's an initiation into society. But I believe that also smaller doses of this were used medicinally. There's an interesting note of this in the earliest preserved medical text in India, the Bower manuscript from the Kashmir region, mostly earlier recensions in what is now Xinjiang area, or north of that, in the Xinjiang area of China. In this Bower manuscript, they talk about Amrit, which is immortality, which is another name of Soma. There are two plant formulas in that text, the Bower manuscript, comprising a total of about 100 plants. A lot of these is difficult to identify botanically, but they also talk about the lower dose. It's like lower dose usage of this substance for medicinal purposes. I think similarly to now, they were doing sort of mini dosing with psychedelics for various kinds of medical practices, various things. But then there was also the high dose initiation by the Brahmin priests. And I think that it seems to me, and it's very hard to know, but the knowledge of those concoctions almost disappeared by around 1,000 years ago, but didn't entirely disappear. Is another interesting point. It was only some way into my research that I luckily stumbled across two areas where they currently still make and use and so on.
What kind of terrain does the plant grow in?
Okay, well, going on to the plant. The plants, what shall I say? This is the interesting.
Okay.
So, most people, in fact, everybody's assumed that Soma was one plant. Mm-hmm. What was this plant? Now, in the Vedas and in the Zoroastrian text, in the Avesta, there are many references to many Somas, many kinds of Soma. In fact, in the Avestan material, great scholar Fritz Stahl once commented that he knew about this. He said he couldn't understand what does it mean, many Somas. In the Indian medical tradition, in Sushruta, which is one of the great Ayurvedic specialists, he talks also about many kinds of Soma plant. He has a couple of dozen Soma plants mentioned, different descriptions, different types of plants, and so on. And in the Vedas, too, you get references to many kinds of Soma. Well, what does this mean, many kinds of soma?
Yeah, then we have to go etymologically.
Well, I think the clue lies in the manufacture of ayahuasca. For me, that was the key to unraveling the whole thing. Now, ayahuasca, as many people know, is a powerful psychedelic concoction in its current form, which is the use of two particular plants, which is not all preparation. Most ayahuasca preparations these days in South America, they use a vine for one chemical, and they use another plant for another chemical. Now, the vine chemical is for monoamine oxidase inhibitors. I'll explain that in a minute. And the other plant, chacruna, it's called, is for DMT.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we're talking about a psychedelic concoction in the ancient world, I believe that if it's one plant, we'd have found it by now.
Mm.
There's been a lot of work on psychoactive plants. It's certainly possible that we'll find a plant that it is totally psychedelic that we haven't found yet. My own belief is that it's, if we look at the neurochemistry of the whole thing, I believe that only really there are tryptamines. Tryptamines is a class of chemicals. In that family of chemicals, we've got LSD, we've got psilocybin mushrooms, and we've got DMT. And I believe it's only that the tryptamines have a special capacity for inducing what we might call a trance state or religious trance. Other plants and psychedelic plants do all sorts of things, but that unique experience of being absolutely near death, breathless in that trance state, I believe it's people have access to that through other means, but the tryptamines have a special capacity for doing that. Now, if we're looking then for DMT, dimethyltryptamine is the chemical. Now, there are about 80 plants known to contain DMT,
Mm-hmm.
and about another 80 plants now known to contain monoamine oxidase inhibitors, and the list increases each year. Now, the thing is that if you consume a plant containing DMT on its own, just that plant, nothing happens because the DMT is broken down by an enzyme in the gut. But if you take a monoamine oxidase inhibitor plant at the same time, that allows the brain to be flooded with DMT for 2 or 3 hours. So in South America, they use the Banisteriopsis carpi vine, primarily for the monoamine oxidase inhibitors, and they use a plant called chacruna for the DMT. That particular formula in South America started to be used first in Brazil about 300 years ago. Not super ancient, that particular concoction. The key point is that you can actually induce the same ayahuasca type of effects from other plants with the same chemical. So when I first drank what was called ayahuasca, that was in Holland in 1997, the plants that were used were Syrian rue for the monoamine oxidase inhibitor, which is a very well-known plant in particularly in the Middle East and so on. Mimosa hostilis, which is a tree which has bark, which is also containing DMT, also has DMT. So the first 3 times I drank what was called ayahuasca was actually on plants that had were different to the traditional ayahuasca, but had the same effect.
Mm.
So that made me certain that in fact you can make ayahuasca preparations from all sorts of plants if you knew enough about botany. Wherever you were, you didn't need to use the two that are properly used in ceremonies these days, the chacruna plant, and the vine. So as I knew that you could make ayahuasca type of formulas from different plants, then I realized that actually in the ancient world it would have been the same. Of course, if you look around you, you can find plants that actually, with enough trial and error, you can make this kind of psychedelic concoction.
Yeah.
So that solves the puzzle of many somas. You can make the soma concoction from many different kinds of plants. And in fact, now hundreds of combinations have been tested by very enthusiastic psychonauts who've been investigating this, and the field grows annually, with people trying out different formulas. So in fact, it's interesting. It was the clue to this whole thing was when I got interested properly. This is going back about 2015, about 10 years ago, in the whole topic. I was reading a text called the Pata Sutra.
Mm-hmm.
Sanskrit text dates back to about the 4th century, and it was just looking at the text, and then it said in that text, when you're making soma, you should add the tips of Cusha grass. What is all that about? So Cusha grass or Dharma grass is very, very common in India. You find it all over India. I find it growing in a park. I found it growing in a park in Delhi, beach in Goa. It grows all over the place, this plant. Very common.
Yeah, they use it also for meditation mats, I think.
That's right. In fact, Kangonda famously described this plant as prescribed to excess in Vedic texts. It's everything. The deities sit on it, you sit on it. It's used for all the sanskar, all these initiation rituals the Brahmins do. You can find it absolutely everywhere. It's revered, it's esteemed, it's called a fantastic thing. It's absolutely embedded in Brahmanical ritual. Also in Buddhist ritual, Buddhist texts also make extensive references to Dharma grass, Cusha grass, and so on. Now, what's so special about this grass that grows everywhere? Well, interestingly, that grass is a relative phalaris grass, and phalaris grass can be full of DMT. So then, when I realized that was the sort of tipping point in this sort of like, oh, that's what they're up to. That's what they're up to there. Now, this Cusha grass, Dharma grass, is a very interesting topic. I spent a lot of time on that, and I tried to get samples from India analyzed. In fact, I had 3 goes at it, and I gave up after a while. Long story, in laboratories all over, I was trying laboratories all over the world because nobody ever tested Cusha grass for DMT or any psychoactive chemical. Nobody's ever done it.
Mm-hmm.
I first tried it in Imperial in London. There's a fellow there. That never happened. And then the long story, and I several other, in fact, about half a dozen other laboratories I contacted about getting this stuff analyzed. One time I brought I brought back a sample plant that was also too small. Another time it was the dried stuff, it all dried out, there was nothing left in it. So anyway, I gave up in the end, trying to get the stuff tested myself, because the problems I faced was that I was doing this research independently. So at university labs, they're saying, well, you haven't got any, scientific protocol for this. So unfortunately, we can't agree to these tests. But I did get one quote from a laboratory in London, and they wanted £100,000 for these tests. Gave up on that. But all the information is out there. If anybody wants to test Cusha grass,
please get in touch.
Yes, or DMT. The other thing about doing these tests, and I've looked into this, Giorgio Samorini, he's a great scholar, lives in Italy. He ran a lot of tests on phalaris grass, different samples from the United States, from Italy. In fact, he published an article in Italian on making ayahuasca analogues, if you like, from grass in Italy. So it certainly works for phalaris grass. The issue with these plants is that at some seasons, at some times of day, certain varieties, they might have no DMT, and at other times they might have quite a lot of DMT. So it would take quite a bit of testing of Cusha grass, Dharma grass to establish how much DMT there is in these plants. So that's what set me off on the ayahuasca analog story. And then I started looking in the text for particular plants, and I identified about a dozen plants that are psychoactive, several of them with DMT, several of them with monoamine oxidase inhibitors. And these plants are identified either in medical texts as Soma plants, or in the Vedas. They talk about the wondrous nature of these plants, the equivalent to Soma, and so on and so on. So that's what the thesis is, essentially.
When did Soma become Amrit?
It right from the beginning always had many names. And as with many things in the Vedas, the Soma has many names in the texts. Or there are just many names for it. And Amrit, interestingly, it's of course, as you may know, in Sanskrit, it's non-death. Amrit.
Yeah.
That same word appears in ancient Greek literature as ambrotos, again non-death, which comes into ambrosia. This is the ambrosia, the name of a brand of custard, also called ambrosia. And one of the talks I gave a while ago, my last slide was ambrosia custard. I said that's how far we've gone. We've gone a long way from the sort of the nectar of immortality to custard. But anyway, so ambrosia, protos, and the reason it's no death is because if you attain one of these trance states, it is timeless. One of the prime hallmarks of mystical experience is timelessness. It's actually, the experience of no death.
Let's talk about higher states of consciousness, and also perhaps the difference between one that comes from taking a substance and one that is acquired without taking a substance.
Yeah, so I believe that actually the trance state, however, when I talk about trance state, it's a whole topic to discuss this, but there are varieties of trance states. But I think it is a very particular human condition There's a well, in fact, that's one of the interesting study of this. I just been reading this is it James Braid on human hibernation?
Observations on trance or human hibernation.
Yeah, 1840 it was published, James Braid,
Uh-huh.
which is a good introduction to this whole topic. And we know that animals hibernate; they go underground, don't need food or water or anything, and their heart rate goes down to perhaps 6 beats a minute, no detectable breath. I believe that the trance, that particular state, what you might call human hibernation, is the samadhi of yoga. That is the goal. It's this particular type of state. I've been investigating this particular. In fact, I'm going to be talking on this at Breaking Convention. This particular state, breathless trance state, is not at all understood in the medical world at the moment. Even people doing psychedelic research, and I've talked to quite a few of those in the last year or two, they haven't actually noticed or taken, that hasn't been on their radar, looking at people in this particular state. They notice other things, brain activity and also so on. But it is, as far I believe, it's a state where you actually go into a kind of hibernation state, where you stop breathing. A speculation, a hypothesis that botanical ecstasies, I mentioned that. I think that, and this is again very speculative, long exposure over many centuries, periodically by Brahmins to this trance state, led eventually to people trying to introduce this trance state through yogic practice. And I believe actually that that's the origins of yoga. And the way to access that state yogically is through pranayama. And interestingly also, some people might be aware of the work of Stanislav Grof, pioneering psychedelic researcher who first took LSD in Prague in the mid-1950s. He had a cosmic experience. Then he was doing LSD therapy for many years, first in Prague, and then he went to the United States in the 60s. And in 1972, his work with LSD was stopped because it was illegal. So he developed holotropic breathing. Mm. Holotropic breathing is essentially pranayama, hyperventilating. And I've actually never done holotropic breathing, but I have experimented with pranayama. And you could enter into the same kind of LSD experience, trance states through.
I've actually had a trance state that sort of came about spontaneously.
Yes.
And the thing is that you're not prepared for it at all. And I mean, in retrospect, so the state lasted for 3 weeks, but in retrospect, I can see that the 3 weeks prior to this state, there was like a pullback. So, the external world became mundane in the sense, but not in the sense of boring, just there was no emotional connection to it. It reminds me a little bit about, the holy pichikaris, the syringes. So you pull the syringe back full of color. So you're draining color from the outside.
Yes.
And then it's pushed so that everything is colored.
Yes, I'm with you. Yes.
And that's what it felt like. So the first 3 weeks was like, hi, yes, no, it flat. And then all of a sudden, I remember standing up in the kitchen and I was getting a bit dizzy. And then over the process of about half an hour, by this time I'd got to the tube station and then I was in a full blown altered state. Everybody on the train became shadows. All the awareness went from the external world. Outside was maybe like 10% of my awareness. I'd go walking in the park. I was experiencing what the blade of grass seemed to be experiencing, and I was experiencing what the mother towards her child was experiencing that I was watching. It was all me.
Mm-hmm.
But the point that I wanted to make was that when you're taking a drug, you know that it's going to last 11 hours or 3 hours. Whereas when it happens to you spontaneously, you have a completely different scenario.
Yes.
Also, there's the expectation of taking the drug. So then you're also expecting that this is going to happen. So that state of mind is different.
Yes.
You said that you managed to create this state through pranayama.
Well, I've not done that much experimentation with pranayama. Certainly, other people I know who have got much more deep into it, and certainly, of course, people who've done holotropic breathing, they have almost like a full-blown LSD experience. I have never done pranayama to that degree, certainly very, very high and similar to LSD, but I'm aware that through breathing exercises, you can attain that sort of state. And as you say, mystical experiences of that type do just happen naturally to people anyway. It's just that yoga practice is just a way to attain that sort of state very specifically.
I mean, I'm sure it's the yoga practice that made the state happen. It wasn't that I did a practice and the state happened. It was more an accumulation that made it happen. Or maybe that I'm sure that both are possible. So I just got a few more questions, and I thought, the first question is really from, you have the Vedic external practices and, sacred geography, and then it moves at some point, it moves to an internal practice. Do you think, I mean, I remember we used to study, I remember the Bhakti movement. And I was wondering if that whole movement had something to do with this external shift, the shift from an external to an internal, because it went from Brahmins to an explosion of different practices.
Yes. And, the Bhakti movement was very influential to this day. But that was for the general population.
Mm-hmm.
And it was for everybody, as it were. But I think that's distinct from the specific kinds of rituals and practices the Brahmins were doing, which they kept to themselves. I mean, of course, the Brahmins, when the Bhakti movement happened, they all became bhaktas too, as it were. But at the same time, they kept their world to themselves.
Yeah, I think I mean more about the exposure of other things that were going on.
Well, yes, certainly. The thing about India that's very interesting is because there have been so many colonial. It's a complicated thing, but so many people have gone and settled in India, whether it's Turks, Mongols, Chinese, Tibetans, Romans, Abyssinians, Portuguese, and this melting pot over thousands of years has produced this very diverse culture. So, and the Brahmins, they still, to this day, they are still changing a lot these days, but they're still very much keep their religion to themselves, and including the Soma rites.
Yeah, so maybe there are some that are still taking the Soma and know the ingredients.
Well, interestingly, there's a book published last year by Erica Dyke and somebody else, I've got it, called Mindscapes. And in there's an article, the first article of the book is by Ian Baker. He's a Tibetan specialist. And we were talking about all this Soma stuff a few years ago. And it's a long story, but essentially he discovered that in Bengal, in Tarapik, there's a living Soma cult there, run by Brahmins. And he discovered this, and before he'd actually published, he was talking about it. And then, in fact, in the very last section of my Botanical Ecstasies, there's a summary of his research, which is now being published in this book. Now, he discovered that they were doing these tantric Soma rites in Bengal, and he didn't participate in the ritual, but he got to know the family that was running the event, if you like, running the events. And then he asked them what plants they were using. They used multi-plant formulas, 84 plants in the formula, for substances. And he only managed to find out about three of those substances. Anyway, we had this conversation. In fact, it was at SOAS. And then he said, I'm going to go back there very soon to try and find out all the plants, find out more about the plants. There was lockdown. He couldn't go. By the time he got back there, the guru of the whole tradition, he died. And that had been passed on from father to son. Anyway, that was the end. We never found out what the plants were that they used. That was a bit frustrating.
I'm just wondering if they would be local to Bengal climate.
It's impossible to know. As I said, there were 84 plants, and that knowledge disappeared. The only other lead on that was when I was 2013. I met this very learned fellow, Persian and Arabic specialist, initiated Sufi, and he participated in a Soma ritual, a Homa ritual, in northern Iran. He was the guest of Kalandar Sufis, these super radical Sufis, and he participated in a ritual there. He had a lot of experience with ayahuasca, and he said it was just like a full ayahuasca experience with these guys. He participated in the ritual on condition that he asked no questions.
Yeah, I remember that in the book,
Yeah, so... but he did notice there was a lot of Syrian rue growing around the temple. So that was a clue.
There was a lot of what?
Syrian rue. That plant, Syrian rue plant, which is the monoaminoxidase inhibitor plant. That's as far as we got there. So it's a bit tantalizing. So I discovered two cases, very, very small, of Soma, still used to this day, but unfortunately no access to the information on northern Iran, and now no access to information in Turkey.
If anyone watching has any information, please do get in
Yes,
touch.
it's very interesting to know.
Yeah, so also just another question on how one interprets or experiences the higher state, how influenced one is from one's upbringing.
I think that's a very interesting and difficult question to answer.
Yeah.
Because psychedelics tend to be a journey through your own internal museum, if you like. When people report on what their experience was afterwards, I mean, if they're raised in a Buddhist culture, they talk about Buddhism, but they're raised if they're like science fiction, it's a bit more science fiction, so it depends on what your cultural background. So that certainly influences your interpretation or description of the experience. But I believe that the key to the whole thing is that there is a kind of death rebirth experience. There's a period of time in the trance experience when you're actually completely cut off from ordinary samsaric life, if you like, and you're just in that state. And if we look, Patanjali's work is, as you know, it's a complex work, heavily influenced by Buddhism. One takeaway from that is that the samadhi state is said to eliminate the sanskaras or the vasanas in the mind. Now, one way of interpreting that is I always use various analogies for that. It's a bit like putting the brain back to factory settings, defragging the hard drive. These are other expressions that are being used. It's these vasanas, these sanskaras in the brain. Of course, we acquire various clouds of tension and misunderstanding and pain, whatever it is. Birth, who knows if it's inherited or whatever, but we do. And then through life, also these sort of these sort of shadows, you might call them, on the mind, these glitches in the mind, they impede our experience of life. And in a samadhi experience, you just have that resetting of the brain. And I think that's the clue to the whole experience.
I think it's like all obstructions and boundaries are removed.
Yes, that's it, yes.
And Aldous Huxley says it beautifully. When the doors of perception are cleansed, you'll see things as they truly are.
Yeah.
Infinite.
That's right, yeah.
That hits the nail on the head, I guess. Yeah. Well, Matthew, thank you so much for explaining all that. And please don't forget that there is a competition. And if you would like to join and win PDF copy of Matthew's book, The Tawny One, all you have to do is, well, you've watched this episode now, so all you have to do is comment below on what you resonated with and what you'll take away. By the way, one more question, Matthew. The title, The Tawny One, could you explain that a little bit?
It was because it was, tawny just means
reddish brown.
Brown, yeah. And interestingly, this substance, when you produce ayahuasca, it nearly always comes out that sort of reddish brownish color. But the point is that this concoction is, if my argument is right, can be from many different kinds of plants. It's almost like a substance with no name. It's the nectar. It's that stuff. So I just wanted to refer to it as a general substance without being specific to what it is.
Lovely. Well, thanks for that, Matthew. Thank you very much.
Right.
And I'll catch you again soon. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and see you again soon. Bye for now.
Cheerio. Bye.